who you are and what you work on.
Hello everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Gary Redistricting. I'm a senior counsel at the Rampant Center for Justice in New York. I work on redistricting and fair representation that spans everything from working on reform efforts across the states, working on federal reform, to litigation in a couple of states where we're doing work to research and both policy research and academic research.
Good afternoon. My name is Redistricting. I'm the Voting Rights and Redistricting Program Manager of California Common Cause. Some of the work that I'm working on right now is mostly focused on charter reform efforts, specifically watchdog 2 issues, setting up independent redistricting commissions in the city of Los Angeles and the other one in the city of San Francisco.
Hey everybody, Dan Kukan, the Director of Redistricting and Representation at Common Cause, based here in Southern California. We're fighting for fair maps in courts, at the ballot box, for ballot initiative, lobbying, all the above. Good to be here.
Thank you all. And before we get into it, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to do our panel, and we're hoping to have a little bit of time for questions at the end. If you have a question, we have note cards in the back. So please write your question on a note card in the back, and then Pedro here, Pedro, please raise your hand, is going to collect those note cards at the end and pick them out if we have time for questions at the end. Thank you so much. So many of us think that redistricting is a wonky issue or maybe uninteresting, maybe less so here since we're all democracy nerds, being here, the regular people. Especially because it only happens every 10 years. But our districts from local city council to congressional seats are really at the very heart of what fair representation means. And we've seen rampant political and racial gerrymandering threats threaten the health of our democracy. So what can we do about this? Our fully empowered independent redistricting commission is here. In 2008, California Common Cause led a coalition that sought to end gerrymandering. California citizens redistricting had been successful since. Thanks to the establishment of the Redistricting Commission, voters, not politicians, interests come first. We'll discuss how we can work state by state and community by community to end gerrymandering across the country. So first, let's take a step back. Level set a little bit. Who draws the lines in redistricting now? So Yuri, can you tell us a little bit about the different models that are used to redistrict?
Yeah, I'd love to. So just to table set, I think there's a whole number of ways to slice and dice the various different redistricting systems that exist across the country. At the Rampant Center, we have drawn 4 broad categories for still dominate the redistricting process. The third type of redistricting system are advisory commissions. And with advisory commissions, there is a commission that draws draft maps, but then sends them to the legislature. There are variations here as well. There are some advice, for example, the legislature can only give the draft map in up or down mode. And there are states like Utah where the legislature can completely ignore what the advisory commission does and just substitute its own commissions where citizens are screened for conflicts of interest and have full authority to adopt maps and generally represent both Republicans, Democrats, and independents. The structure and the number of commissioners varies from the states that use them. Currently, there are 4 independent commission states. That's here in California and Arizona, which was
outcomes across and commission types.
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways to use to distinguish between different types of commissions and put it all the way before, during, and after. So you have different commissions approach, for example, the appointment process. Before you can have a commission up and running, what role do legislators play in their actual appointments? In the most independent processes, they play a very little role. They don't get to a point directly, they don't get to a point at political crony. Recent elected officials, they can get on the phone and give instructions. So before the process starts, when the commission is formed, that's sort of one way to distinguish. As during the process, if you have a ban on communications between decision makers and outside folks, then elected officials can, again, make those calls to the people they directly appointed. You'll wink and nod, have your proverbial smoke in the room telling you what to do. So during the process, if you ensure all communications are out and open, that's really a hallmark of an independent process. Finally, at the very end, when we have the, who actually gets to make the decision, a truly independent process gives commissions, the commissions themselves, the final say. And as Yuri was alluding to, there's some places like Utah where they have to take it back to the legislature. Utah's a good example, a great bipartisan process, lots of public input. And the legislature really working the trash, divided Salt Lake County up into 4 congressional districts for the sole purpose of making sure no Democrat could get elected. It didn't really matter what the community had to say. So really who gets to make the final decision is kind of and also an important marker of
So we've got this really long history of gerrymandering for political gain in a lot of parts of the country, including California. California, as Yuri mentioned, now has an independent citizens redistricting commission. And can you give us a little bit of the history of how we got here in California with our independent commission, both on the state level and some of the local commissions?
Yeah, we can start by that's nice to hear. I assure you what I said before was brilliant. Let me tell you a little bit about how independent redistricting works in California. And it really does kind of represent one of the gold standard models for reform. You have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, a 14-person panel, really is a way to balance out partisanship. You have 4 people who are not affiliated with either party. There are very strong conflict of interest restrictions ensuring that political insiders aren't allowed in the room. No political operatives, no current recent elected officials, no lobbyists. There's even a restriction on donors over a certain threshold. There's a really robust screening process. Like people, it's almost like you got to apply to college. There's essays, there's interviews, to ensure that people are really committed and willing to do the work in a nonpartisan and open way. You have requirements for going around the state, hearing from the public, no conversations about map drawing happen outside of those public meetings. So again, no smoke-filled rooms, no calls, secret calls for legislators. It's just not allowed. You've got a 2-part selection process, sort of one's randomized, and if the initial group doesn't really represent the diversity of the state, it's up to those folks who were picked first to make sure that it does look like a state, like the remaining commissioners really reflect the diversity of California. And I'll talk a little bit about how we kind of got to that model. I think it can be described as sort of a long, decades-long process of realizing that politicians have no business doing anything when it comes to redistricting. I mean, you had early reform that handed the power to statewide elected officials. Arkansas in like 1936 said we'll give it to 3 statewide elected officials, but not legislators. There could be a conflict of interest. That didn't work out so great. You had models in Hawaii, Pennsylvania, where it was legislators, but there had to be partisan balance. So, at least we're going to put people who have a conflict of interest in the room to make those decisions, but at least there's got to be equal number of Democrats and Republicans. I think in that case, you sometimes saw sort of not so gentlemanly agreements protecting incumbents. Then you had kind of next generation direct appointment by legislators. So it wasn't legislators themselves, but again, sometimes their friends, people they know that they could give a rate to say, this is how we want to make sure you move the line around my house. So again, I think that we're slowly working our way toward a more independent model. Eventually, sort of Arizona, we had a direct appointment by legislators, but it's got to be from a screen list. In Arizona, they've got a body that takes a look at folks, make sure there's not conflicts of interest there, takes them out if they don't have any business doing the job, then legislators can pick. And then that eventually evolved to kind of California, Michigan, where you have a very, very limited role for legislators and the robust conflicts of interest list that I described, and you may or may not have heard earlier. And now that's sort of where we landed. Legislators, they do have a slight role where they can strike people from the list. The thinking was that if anyone did research to kind of smoke out of all of the legislators, so that was their limited role. So that's kind of how we got to what ends up being the most independent kind of standard models they see here in California and Michigan.
One mic. Oh, we have 2. Okay. All of the work that we did in California to. Sorry. So we're still not in California. Russia, could you just give us a quick update on commissions here in California?
So building on the history that Dan just shared, there were 3 bills that were before the governor and the legislature this year. So they were focused on establishing independent redistricting commissions in the city of Los Angeles, Orange County, and Sacramento County. I think the big push for these came from information that we saw coming out of local redistricting processes where they weren't as independent as we thought. And so we saw political meddling, we saw people engaging in what we determined ex parte communications, having conversations with commissioners to help draw those boundary lines. And so the big push, Assembly Bill 1248, it is to bring independent redistricting commissions to the larger jurisdictions here in the state of California. So for jurisdictions that have a population over 300,000, they would be required by state law to establish an independent redistricting commission. And then for school districts and for school boards who have residents of over 500,000, they would be responsible for setting an independent commission to draw the boundaries for those school lines. Because we also see some of the same things that we see play out in the redistricting process for the political lines happen at the school board level as well. I think one of the big takeaways of the bills that we're seeing is that in spite of the horrific things that we saw come out of the lead states in Los Angeles, is really these push for some basic principles. And the basic principles kind of lean on the items that Yuri touched on before, and that is including bans on ex parte communications, ensuring that the definition of community of interest is at the forefront of what the commissioners decide on how they're going to draw those district lines.
Thanks. So we'll touch a little bit more on LA in a minute, but first I want to turn more to the national context. So Yuri, could you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing across the country, be it with court cases or experiences with redistricting in other states?
Yeah, I think all these things connect. There's a lot to say in terms of the somewhat dismal state of redistricting across the country. I'm going to focus on a couple of things. One, I want to talk about the ways that the legal landscape has shifted as the U.S. Supreme Court has grown more extreme, more overtly partisan, and really emboldened bad action by political interests. So over the course of the last decade, the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. In the 2013 Shelby County Beholder decision, it invalidated and left inert one of the core provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act that required certain states with a history of discrimination to submit their maps for clearance before they took effect to the U.S. Department of Justice or to a federal judge. So for the first time since 1965, we went into this redistricting cycle without those pre-clearance protections. Communities of color, for the first time, lacked those protections. They also, the U.S. Supreme Court also made it more difficult to bring cases under the other part of the Voting Rights Act, which is called Section 2, which allows private parties to bring litigation after a policy or a map has been passed that denies communities of color equal opportunity to participate in the process. It didn't fully vet Section 2. That was the recent case out of Alabama, Maryland, and Milligan. That was a huge victory, massive success. But I want to emphasize that that just helped the status quo. That helped the line. There weren't any gains made in that litigation. The other big thing that I want to highlight that the U.S. Supreme Court has done, and there are many others, but this is the third one that I'll touch on now, is they definitively said that federal courts cannot police partisan gerrymandering. In the 2019 case out of North Carolina, in Rucho v. Common Cause, the court said that, yeah, partisan gerrymandering is bad, but federal courts cannot, they don't have the ability, the wisdom, the knowledge, or the standard needed to be able to resolve partisan gerrymandering disputes. So what did that mean? What did those legal developments mean as we went into this redistricting cycle? Well, if you look at what legislatures across the country did, what politicians across the country did, they took those signs to mean we have free reign. And that's an important thing to remember. Part of what the law does, part of what these legal safeguards do, is they have a prophylactic impact. Bad conduct is reined in simply because people feel like that there is risk involved. And that went away. And so we have seen raising lawlessness across the country. There was no attempt to comply with the Voting Rights Act in states across the South, in states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, others. There were explicit attempts in places like Florida to ignore the state constitution and the protections that voters of color get from the state constitution in Florida. And Governor DeSantis specifically targeted a district that gave Black voters an opportunity to elect a preferred candidate in northern Florida and said, no, dismantle that district. He vetoed maps until the legislature went along with that. And under the state constitution, we won repeatedly, but every single time the process went back to the same political commission that submitted gerrymandered maps over and over and over again. And what that means is the 2022 election was held using bad maps. And given how close control of Congress is, when you look at the fact that discriminatory maps were in place in Alabama, in Georgia, in Louisiana, in Florida, we have courts that have decided these cases. When you start to add up these districts, it's a massive, massive, massive impact. And so the thing that I want to convey is in the democracy space, it's hard to unwind harm because elections happen and we have to live with the consequences of those elections. And it's absolutely critical that we have and it means look had solutions in states which wouldn't necessarily produce perfect maps, but certainly when you look across the country, they aren't tainted with the same sort of overt attempts to ignore the law, to carve out communities, and to skew representation.
Thanks for that. So speaking of how we get to good maps, obviously independent commissions take the power away from politicians and put it in citizens' hands to draw those lines. But what are independent commissions actually doing that's so different from these other models that makes a difference to communities? Dan, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, independent commissions place a really huge focus on putting people first, getting input from communities. There's obviously requirements and laws that create these commissions for them to do so, but just the very nature of the way that they're picked means that they really have a good faith desire to hear from the public and learn, and not to draw maps for political advantage. We can talk a little bit about sort of how that plays out both kind of before, during, and at the end of the process with results. California's commission had 200 pre-mapping sort of community sessions, just introducing people to the idea of what redistricting was, kind of a reminder. Radio advertising, billboards, bus stop ads, social media. They put in ads in newspapers, weeklies. There was even kind of an interesting creative program to send to solicit community interest information from jails, people who are in the jail system, and they got 1,300 packets back and some really fascinating information on that. During the mapping process, again, there were 200 fully public and live stream hearings on mapping. Tens of thousands of Californians gave public comments. We had hundreds of organized constituency groups that weighed in. We also had language interpretation of that community input so people could respond to it in the language of their choice. What are some outcomes? What does this actually do for communities? I'm going to highlight a few stories that are in a great report by the California Common Cause co-author with the Legal University of California and the U.S. Schwarzenegger Institute that really examines closely the work of the California Commission. Well, for starters, there were no lawsuits. I mean, you heard Yuri tick off, sort of several lawsuits per second, because that's how redistricting goes. When there's a map drawn, somebody sues. Incredibly, California has done the process, nobody sued. There were some interesting community-specific stories, in rural areas of Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. They used to be kind of united with really very wealthy coastal communities. It didn't really make a lot of sense when they got community feedback on this process. They ended up in their own districts as agricultural communities. We saw Black, Latino, and Asian American majority influence districts that arose directly from community input. There was to get very kind of granular, to learn to think about the way that California Commission really listens to very granular, specific community input. There was an Asian American neighborhood in San Jose, Berryessa, which talked about a community center they shared with their neighbors, Mandarin language classes that the community used, an arts festival that was kind of central to everybody local, and that made the case successful for keeping them in a state legislative district. There was testimony from Latinos in Kern, Bakersfield County, in Central Valley, about the need to keep the communities out of the children and grandchildren of undocumented folks, and what some of the economic inequities that existed in those communities, making it essential to keep them together, and that was also in the Latino majority district directly. So just a huge difference in outcomes. I'll actually just talk about one other state, well, California, but Colorado also has an independent commission, kind of really created. There was a big push, including from Common Cause, to get a majority Latino district. And although we didn't quite get majority Latino, we got a Latino influence district and resulted in the first Latino ever being elected to Congress from the state. So it matters. Yeah. So this input matters when you have decision makers that are willing to listen. So that's usually
And I think what Dan is laying out is critical, and I just want to take a half step back. Because what redistricting is all about and why it happens is because the population changes. Communities evolve, states evolve, demographics shift, the way that people live changes ultimately over the course of time. And ours is a system that is supposed to adapt with these changes. That's why we conduct the census, to track them from a population standpoint. And it's actually why the redistricting cycle exists from this standpoint, at least from a numerical standpoint. We need to rebalance districts from the standpoint of each one having roughly the same number of people. But there also needs to be that qualitative component, and that's what Dan is discussing. Independent redistricting injects that qualitative component by looking to the people who are most familiar with their communities and the ways that they've evolved, rather than looking to elsewhere. And what is that elsewhere? Well, when you look at other states, mostly it's political data. They're looking at specifically, and as the sophistication of data has increased, so has increased the sophistication of. There is a very good understanding of that the narratives that sit in back rooms and iterate over and over and over again, trying to control for all the variables to produce specific political outcomes. And that's the real difference. It's whether the process is about generating certain outcomes as the front end goal, or whether it's about capturing communities and then making sure that the way the districts were configured on the back end complies with various safeguards. That makes sense from a partisan fairness standpoint, from a racial fairness standpoint. And I think those are really the key differences. And when you look reduced to a label, which is so crude, and even what that breeds is grouping people together that may not share much at all, and that degrades the entire political process from the way campaigns are run and what candidates appeal to the sort of polarization that we're seeing. And while the political science is uncertain around the link between gerrymandering and polarization, if you talk to lawmakers, there's certainly an acknowledgement that because the competition comes exclusively at the primary level, because the districts are drawn to perform consistently at the general level, that impacts the tenor of the legislative discourse and the way that business gets done.
Thanks. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and address the elephant in the room, which is that we are here in LA, which had a huge redistricting scandal. Many of you may be aware of this scandal already that happened this past winter when audio recordings were leaked of city council members making racist, indicative remarks, but also planning attempts to intentionally undercut the power of communities of color and renters in the local redistricting process. And in response to this, we've seen both legislation introduced on the state level, as well as really strong local efforts calling for the creation of an independent commission, hopefully in LA, which Russia has been working on. So Russia, can you tell us a little bit more about where we are and how we got here?
So there's two actual cities that have a low kerfuffle. This is the city of Los Angeles, the other was San Francisco. So as part of my role, I'm watchdogging those issues and participating heavily in both of those issues. So the local responses in both jurisdictions, they're calling for independent redistricting in both jurisdictions. And the goal is to put ballot initiatives before the voters, hopefully in November of 2024, so that the voters can decide to establish independent redistricting commissions in both of these jurisdictions. So those commissions are currently set up right now based on some of the definitions that your insurance officials appoint someone, and then their appointee, their chosen person, kind of does their wheeling and dealing for them. So we saw that explicitly on the tapes. You know, we heard council members explicitly say, like, get your person in order. What is your person doing to this map? and they need to be called back to the table. And since then, there is what they call the ad hoc committee for governance reform. So it's a subcommittee of the city council in Los Angeles. They've been meeting regularly, and as part of their community meetings and meeting regularly, they are trying to gather input from the public, from organizations like the Brennan Center, from organizations on how do you set up an independent redistricting commission? What should that look like? What should be at the forefront? What should we set up here in LA and in San Francisco? So to answer how we really got here, it's like we just saw gerrymandering, political gerrymandering, and incumbents influencing the process. And really the purpose of that influence was, how do I preserve my seat? How do we redraw this map so that I have another chance at winning to be the representative of this seat? Which gets to a lot of the points of what Yuri was saying, is that it really undermines the electorate and their ability to choose who they want to represent them. What we're learning though, there's a lot of things that we're learning out of these processes, and what we're observing mostly is that the champions for independent redistricting is cropping up all over. So it's from a lot of grassroots organizations. So grassroots efforts are really leading the way here in Los Angeles, and that's kind of one of the folks who are really on the ground. The other folks are good government groups like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, the Brennan Center, other organizations, and even local media, and hyper-local media. Really hyper-local media is really paying attention to this issue. And all of that collective, that coalition together is really what's kind of pushing this through. What we're seeing in terms of principles that are coming out of this, some high-level principles that we're hearing that folks want to see, is strict ban on ex parte communications. What we mean by ex parte communications is the commissioner, the independent commissioner, being able to have a conversation outside of a public meeting with an elected official or someone else to influence their decision making. The other principle that we're really seeing is putting at the forefront the definition for the community of interest, and ensuring that that community of interest is at the forefront of how maps are drawn in the future. Another really large principle that we're seeing is ensuring that commissioners are independently selected, so that the elected official can't decide that this is my person, these are the people that we're going to put in the seats, and ensuring that the people who sit at that table are individuals just like you and I, who've gone through some of the steps that Dan shared before, but they're coming to the table with an interest and a desire to decide how are we going to draw district maps and district lines in a way that can best reflect the citizens who live here.
And that brings up a really interesting point of talking about the local advocacy. You are working on a local level. I, as the legislative director for California Common Cause, are working on a statewide level. You've got this interplay going on between different advocacy efforts and what may work best for a specific jurisdiction, or if you're going back to your state and are interested in independent commissions, what may work best for you. So, Russia, can you talk a little bit more about how you've seen that interplay work out, the effectiveness?
So I think this is going to be the nuance. Like I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to say it depends, right? And so I think that at the grassroots level in LA, we're seeing it happen at a local level. We also see an interplay of the state legislation. So there's a little bill in the moving before the legislature right now is sitting on the governor's desk. It's called Senate Bill 52. That one would actually require the city of LA to have an independent redistricting commission by default with some basic parameters by 2030, regardless of what the city does. So if the governor decides to sign that, LA has to do it. If the governor signs AB 1248, larger jurisdictions, they have to do it with some basic parameters. And so I think that interplay is beneficial. And the reason I think it is beneficial is because once we allow the local jurisdictions to really get down in the weeds, they can decide for themselves what other parameters do we want to see, what do we want to see really fleshed out. And so I don't necessarily see them as a tension, I just see them as building off one another, and that you can have it happen and germinate from the ground, or have a state representative put together a piece of legislation before you were even mandated. And so we're seeing it all over the state, happening at the local level, happening at the state level, and I think they'll both bear out and they'll come out with results.
Thanks for that. And Greg, can you maybe add a little of your experience with advocacy efforts in other states?
Yeah, I think one of the difficult things about independent redistricting is the fact that the 4 states that currently use it all have the initiative process. And that is, Colorado is a bit of an outlier. It's not worth going into the nuances there, but essentially it was the credible threat of a citizen initiative that then prodded the legislature into action. And this kind of, I feel like what's needed for reform in redistricting, because the power of that redistricting pen is too powerful. Once you have it, you can't give it up. Is that there needs to be uncertainty. There needs to be something that creates a little bit of opportunity. I was working on a reform effort in Pennsylvania, and part of that came from the political will, and it didn't get over the finish line. The pandemic derailed our efforts, but there was real momentum building, and the reason why is because, in all likelihood, because there was a governor's veto on the table. The legislature was under Republican control, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was seen as being favorable to Democrats. There was suddenly the will among Republican leaders to give up the pen and give it into a process because they felt like going through the legislative process, having their veto, and having the process end up at the state Supreme Court was probably going to produce something more favorable to Democrats than what a commission process would produce. And so that created a bit of an opportunity. So that's what would produce. And so that created a bit of an opportunity. So that's one way to come in and say we're going to be gerrymandering, or making sure that there is gerrymandering, or making sure that there is split government. And so the normal legislative process wouldn't allow one party to ram through its gerrymandering grounds over the objection of the other. The other thing that I'll say, and the other thing that I'll highlight is don't turn your nose up at half measures. Better is better. And even in a state like New Mexico, where a fairly weak advisory model was adopted, from a structural standpoint, it still changed the game in terms of the public's engagement in redistricting, in terms of the public's understanding of redistricting, and overall transparency in the process. And that shouldn't be minimized because we should all be thinking about this in the long term. And that first step helps unlock additional reform possibilities that will take that model and strengthen it. The same thing is true in Virginia. I hate to use sports analogies, but I'll lean on football for this one. Sometimes you got to get off your own goal. And that means you're not going for a Hail Mary pass. It means you might be running the football to give yourself a little bit of breathing room. And so that's the other thing to remember. Think of this as a multi-step process, and think about what are some intermediate goals that are achievable, even if there is a longer-term goal.
I really love that takeaway of don't be discouraged. So with that, questions.
Capture everyone. It was how gerrymandering often used in this idea of redistricting. How it's not clear to this. I think a lot of people have how gerrymandering parties.
I can start again. Well, I think it works by, again, And so parties have really robust databases that collect data from every single election. They track every single voter that casts a ballot, and they actually ascribe the likelihood that someone will vote, has voted, and what that person's likely partisanship is. They do that household by household by household. And given the increase in data that's available, and given the sophistication of data analytics now, it is really not that hard to actually get a pretty accurate picture of how different individuals will behave in elections. And so then what people who gerrymander do is they draw a district map, and then they run different election scenarios through it. What happens if this were the map in a good Republican year? What happens if this were the map in a good Democratic year? What happens if turnout is low? What happens if turnout is high? How does this map perform in a presidential year, in a midterm year, so on and so forth? And the goal is to iterate and to figure out what map will most consistently produce the same result that entrenches one set of political interests to the exclusion of others, and lock in the majority and essentially deprive voters of their vote.
Yeah, I'll just add in that the way that's done sort of on a community level is to either pack or crack voters. To put as many of one type of voter in as few districts as possible, pack them, so that maybe they can win overwhelming majorities of just one, maybe two districts, but have no impact on the rest of them. Or they'll crack them, divide them up between a bunch of different districts, so they can't really win in any one.
And what we heard on the LA tapes, we listened really closely. We actually hear one of the councilors says, go back and run the data. Do you have time to call your staff? So that data that Yuri was just talking about, do you have staff for these two staffers to go back to each other? And I want you to run these maps. I want you to rerun these maps to make sure they look good for a certain council member, because they wanted to make sure that this one individual looked good. He ended up actually losing, which is great. But that was what they were doing. And they were rerunning that data and rerunning that map. And it's caught on tape. Rerun the data, call your staff, have them run the map, so that we can see what that data looks like, so we can reproduce a map that's favorable to.
I have we have a lot of questions, so I think it would be great if the panelists could touch on, the acknowledgement that there is polarization and geographic story between rural and urban, and are the maps like equally unfair? But the question is like, and I think the question about like rural, so all of that, I think it would be great to hear from Nate and Dan on what does expertise look like, and how do you maybe think about incorporate community business. What does that process look like? Like what are the process look like? Like what are the factors? Why are we using these particular factors?
Just to address one thing, it's not like somebody mentioned kind of sorting, a great sorting of urban areas and Republicans moving out or rural areas. I just want to address that. That just definitely doesn't explain sort of any gerrymander. There have been courts that have looked at, like in Wisconsin, and specifically at whether the sorting of Republicans and Democrats in the state was explaining a skewed map, and it really didn't. That maps can still be manipulated despite the great sort. There is, I think, one of the challenges, and this was discussed a lot in the report about the Health Commission, about how to take in, effectively take in community of interest information. And really, it sometimes I think can feel like a fire hose, and kind of distinguishing between kind of different, opposing viewpoints. I think commissioners do the best they can. Again, these are good faith actors. I think they come out with pretty decent results, but I think that the challenge of future commissions is really learning how to process that effectively. It sounds like something mentioned AI. I think we're figuring out whether that could play a role on the issue. Thoughts on AI?
Well, I don't have too many thoughts on AI as they relate to gerrymandering, but I'll say the thing that polarization has really done is made gerrymandering easier. because again, people are voting along more predictable patterns. And so it's not that the sort of geographic distribution and the tendency of Democratic voters to live in cities and suburbs builds in a skew to district maps. It's more that that reality has made it much easier to draw very reliable jury figures.
So we should probably talk about multi-member districts.
Yes.
So, we've got the two comments, and I think it's just worth kind of noting. I'm better on the legal policy where I was talking about cause. There's my colleagues. I was at Fairwood, and now I'm counseling on cause. And, I think a lot of people have thought about, what does that have to play? What can we learn from Portland? So I will quickly respond, and I'll pass to my colleagues for the answer. I think that there is a very long and rich history on these alternative voting systems in this country. And I've studied them here in Los Angeles. There was actually a work representation passed, multiple parties here. There's a lot to be learned from that time. And in this modern day, you have to think about information and the information voters have to make important decisions. So whether that be, right now, most county elections in local offices in California are nonpartisan, they're elected. And how can we expect voters? How do we inform voters? And those are the immediate priorities of California Congress. And how do we kind of build a more informed, engaged? I think that there's still an opportunity to have more proof of concept on these different political reforms. And I was personally, I'll take out my common cause hat. I worked on Albany, so California, the first city to have proportional representation. Very good. I think there needs to be more of a concept. We want to see that, and I think there'll be a lot. But what do you all think about, maybe this is more of a great question than maybe the end question, but multi-member districts, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a difficult question to answer because the devil is really in the details when it comes to multi-member districts, ranked choice voting. So first, multi-member districts, first past the post, which is winner take all, does not work. That's an old tool that is often used to discriminate against black voters. And so that is kind of the worst of all. Now, multi-member proportional systems are very intriguing, and I think they're particularly intriguing in the moment that we are currently in, both politically and legally. The thing that I would say, the thing why I'm not up here saying, endorsing and whatnot, one, the Rampant Center has a taken position on multi-member proportional representation. So these are things that we are researching, we are thinking about, we want to be very careful when we do take a position on these sorts of things. And the reason why is because certain communities face all sorts of barriers to political participation. Certain communities are registered at different rates, certain communities turn out at different rates, and there are structural reasons for why that is the case. And all of those sorts of factors need to be considered. You can't think about proportional multi-member districts in kind of a hypothetical scientific experiment standpoint. You have to think about the practical realities and what will actually play out and happen on the ground. Now, what I will say, one of the things that I've been working on are state voting rights acts. And increasingly the trend with state voting rights acts, and California was the first, Washington, my state, was the second. Now there is one in New York, where I currently live. There's one in Connecticut, there's one in Oregon, and there are bills pending in Michigan, in New Jersey, Maryland. It's an idea that's gaining traction. One of the features of state voting rights acts is there is flexibility when it comes to how a voting rights violation can be fixed, which includes things like ranked choice voting, like cumulative voting. And so there is an increasing awareness that we have to think more expansively. But I think there's also an awareness that the specific facts and the circumstances matter. What will work in one place won't necessarily work in another.
Yeah, common cause is largely in the same place. I think we take the lead from local stakeholders to see how reform is going to play out in that context. I've been involved in alternative voting fights on ranked choice voting, in Hawaii. Multi-member districts is something we just haven't really fleshed out as much, and but it sort of doesn't pop up.
Also, that absolutely the California Common Cause supported opposed legislation that would have repealed that reform in California and its use. I think they're out of time.
All right, we're out of time, but thank you so much for those audience questions, and a huge thank you to our panelists.